Welcome back to the Joy of Vinyl. I'm Rick Coste. Okay, here we go. I know Thomas has been waiting for this one. Now, if you don't know, Thomas Tan is the host of the Thomas and Stereo channel. He's also the man behind the Galion TS120 integrated tube amp. So, what's today's show about? Well, I recently had the pleasure to compare the TS120 Standard Edition, which I own, with the Special Edition, which was loaned to me. A little background first, and how this all came about, as it's relevant to today's discussion. When I was shopping for a new tube amp earlier this year, I looked at a few, but I ultimately settled on the Galion Standard Edition, the TS120. There were a few others on my shortlist, but I was intrigued enough by the Galion that I went with my gut and I purchased it. I'm so glad I did too. That amp has only gotten better with time, and we'll get to that. After purchasing the amp, I decided to replace my speakers a few months later. So I reached out to Thomas for his opinion on a couple of the options I was looking at, a couple of the speakers that I was considering. So this led to him asking if I would like to compare the Standard Edition to the Special Edition. I was very interested, so a few months later after that conversation, the Special Edition arrived, and I had a chance to spend some time with it before sending it back, which I still have to do. Which leads me to today. Now, I'm not going to approach this as a typical review. Most all the reviews that you'll see out there already are of the Special Edition. And I posted my own review about the Standard Edition shortly after I bought it. I also want to stay away from the usual audiophile descriptions, which can be taken different ways. There's only so many ways to say holographic sound or three-dimensional soundstage, which the TS120, both versions, brings to the table. But I want to be honest and clear. So to kick things off, when you set the two side by side, there is no obvious differences. They have the exact same feature set. You can switch between Class A and Class AB. You can bypass tone controls. You can bias the tubes at the press of a couple of buttons. And this isn't auto-biasing on the fly, nor is it a manual process that you have to watch a meter and use a screwdriver. You just hit the two buttons. It's as simple as hitting change, then bias, and waiting a few seconds for it to do its work. It's convenient, it's well thought out, and it's outside of the signal path. The only real visual differences are the tubes, at least today. Both editions are shipped with PS Vane KT88s, but I replaced mine a couple of months ago with Mullard KT88s. The reason for that being, I really like Mullard tubes. I've used new old stock Mullards for years in my phono stages, so I went with them. They're smooth, they're warm, and they gently roll off the high end. My ears, I've noticed as I've gotten older, can't really handle high end as well as they used to. So the Special Edition arrived with Shuguang Black Treasure KT88Z tubes. Probably said that Shuguang wrong, but I'm going to stick with that. In the time I spent with it, I listened to it both with those Black Treasures and with my Mullard KT88s for, to give it an honest comparison. Plus, I really wanted to hear how it performed with my tube preference. I will say one thing though, these amps are heavy. I think I actually strained my back moving them around. So it's my first high-end audio injury. Now, I've mentioned there is no real difference, when you set them side by side, except the power tubes and also the side panels. If you're observant, you'll notice that, at least with the models I have here. Yet the price difference is nothing to sneeze at. The Standard is currently at $34.95 US per Galion's website currently, and the Special is $44.95. So where's the difference? Well, it's inside, and it has everything to do with the capacitors that are being used. The Special Edition has Jupiter capacitors which are specifically designed for audio applications. They are among the best. Both amps employ Clarity capacitors, but I believe the Special Edition probably has higher end Clarity capacitors. The Jupiters are the star here, however. From what I understand, at least when the Special Edition was first designed and voiced, is that the Jupiter capacitors that it's using hadn't even hit the general market yet. But that's the bottom line, with all else being equal. So, to compare them, I pulled out some of my usual reference albums. Dire Straits, Brothers in Arms is one. I remember buying this when it came out in 1985. I loved Money for Nothing. One of the best guitar intros ever. Also, I pulled out Pink Moon by Nick Drake, Prince's Sign of the Times, and you know what? I think I actually bought my copy the week it came out. But my favorite to test things out like this is the song Frankenstein from the Edgar Winter Group's album, They Only Come Out at Night. That album came out in 1972. I remember, just as an aside, I remember being a 6-year-old kid who was into old Universal horror movies and being enthralled by the song, both because of the name Frankenstein and, to my young mind, the weird sounds that exploded from those speakers whenever I heard it. It was appropriately named. But it's a great song, and it's a great song to measure soundstage with. One of the best, in my opinion. So I listened to everything in both Class A, or I did listen to everything in both Class A and Class AB. Another great feature with both amps, because you can switch. I also went through all the tone selections. For that, I mean both bypassing the tone controls and also employing them at times. And as a complete aside, and this has nothing to do with comparing the two amps, it more has to do with a pleasant surprise, which has yet again changed my listening experience with the Galion TS120, the Standard Edition. When I first reviewed my amp, I said this. Instead of switching back to A, which I'd had it set on, I switched to B. And that was the sound. I flipped back and forth between B and the tone control settings I had with the added bass, and I could detect only very little difference. In B, I felt the bass was more controlled and more present. Now that was early on. Ever since then, I've been listening with the tone selection at B. The B sound profile bypasses the tone controls, but it adds its own little color. It's almost like a tone pre-select in a way, and some reviewers have called it a bit more musical. I think Thomas has too. I fell into this camp. The A to me, or the A sound profile, sounded more neutral. When I switched between the two originally, I felt the A sound profile was a bit listless and maybe lacking depth, which the B profile seemed to provide. So from the first week I bought it, and for the next several months, it remained consistently set at B. If an album had too much trouble, I should say, I would engage the tone controls to reduce it. Now, I was happy. Everything was great. So here we are today. I plugged in the Special Edition. I biased the tubes. I put it in Class A. I settled back, and I listened to the album selections that I had pulled out. When I got to Frankenstein, I was blown away. I had never heard the song sound so good. And that on a 50-year-old album. To say the soundstage had somehow expanded isn't doing it justice. I hadn't heard it like that on my Standard Edition, and I have to admit, I was a little worried. Had I made a mistake? Should I have bought the Special Edition instead? Surely it can't be that great a difference. So I got up to switch everything over to my amp, because I wanted to hear it again, and realized something I hadn't noticed. The only thing I would change about the TS120 is the little blue lights on the front panel. When you're listening to music, they're there to indicate, standby, which class that the amp is in, and the input that's being used. So I had put little pieces of black electrical tape over these lights to hide them, especially if I'm listening at night. There are no lights to indicate which sound profile you're in. What I hadn't noticed was that the Special Edition, when it arrived, was set to the A profile, which is a more neutral and perhaps better represents the sound coming from the source. I had just assumed it was on B, where I always have mine. It's a dumb assumption on my part. So I switched the Special Edition to the B profile, and it still sounded wonderful, but I surprisingly found I preferred A, which is the opposite, complete opposite of what I experienced with my Standard way back when I first got it. So I hooked my amp back up, set it to A, and sat back. Unbelievably, that soundstage was back. It exploded just as it had with the Special. I was confused. I switched back to B, and yep, there was the sound that I'd been listening to, then back to A. Somehow it didn't sound as weak as I'd thought when I'd first tried it all those months ago. The bass was even present. And then it hit me. It had been a few months. That's why. Thomas recommends that the Galion be given at least 300 hours, and yes, I said 300 hours, to fully break in and to achieve its real voice. 300 hours is a lot of listening hours. On average, I listen to music about, I'd say, 2 hours a day, on average. To hit 300 hours would mean, maybe 4 or 5 months. I'd owned my amp for 6 or 7 months when I did this comparison test. Of course it didn't sound its best during that first month, especially in the A sound profile. Now, well after being broken in, it's there, and you can hear it. For most of my comparison, I kept it in A. I really enjoyed what both amps produced in the A sound profile. As I said, I did go through all the different selections between classes, between sound profiles, tones. Class A and the sound profile A turned out to be my preference. Now, back to why we're here. The Shuguang Black Treasure Tubes have a much different voice than my Mullards. The Black Treasures are more dynamic, and they add a bit more punch, maybe a bit more clarity on the high end. I have to say I was pleased with them. The mid-range was more present with them as well. Definitely not harsh in any way, shape, or form. If you want to impress someone and you have this amp, I'd say throw those Black Treasures in and stand back and just, watch the smile on their face. The amp sings with them. So then I did what I wanted to do and put my Mullards in. I was back to the sound I like to live with. It was smoother. It was, a bit more laid back. So where do I stand on the comparison after listening, after a few hours of listening, off and on over the past few weeks? Do I wish I had gone with the special edition originally instead? I do love the standard edition and the setup that I have today. My turntable aside, it really is the star of the show here. It was money very well spent, to be honest. The standard is fairly priced because it achieves a sound more expensive amps aspire to. The term, punches above its weight class, while cliche, it's a very appropriate one to use here. The special edition does have a trick up its sleeve, and it goes back to those capacitors I mentioned earlier, the Jupiter caps. What I found when listening to the special edition, and here I have to get a little audiophile-y. I just made that word up, by the way. I found the presentation with the special edition more defined. And here I'm talking about my impressions of that song Frankenstein. The instrument separation was clearer. The bass was there. I could feel the bass drum. And I don't listen at high volumes. But there was also something with the mid-range that sounded smoother. Now, I'm not sure what Thomas did, but there is a texture to the mid-range that is different than with the standard edition. Not that the standard is lacking, it's just different. Maybe a bit more pleasant. That's probably the right word. Pleasant to listen to. I haven't suffered any bouts of listening fatigue with the standard edition, but I'm almost certain I could throw any recording at the special edition and never encounter listening fatigue. Now, if you were to ask me which I recommend, I think it comes down to maybe two things: budget and the rest of your components, speakers and all, especially speakers. Now, I've built a system around the standard edition that brings out the sound that I love to listen to, but I had to build it around my amp. Set budget aside, if you're going to spend $3,500 on an amp, you can probably be convinced to go to $4,500. But you need to get something for that extra $1,000. What you'll get with a special edition is an amp that will work well with any speakers and that has that mid-range texture that's hard to achieve. With the standard, originally, I was using Klipsch speakers prior to the KLH Model 5s, and the Klipsch ran a bit bright, a bit too much at times for my taste. And the Model 5s solved for that, as did the Mullard KT88s. Those helped immensely. The special edition, I feel, takes care of all that for you with the capacitors that Thomas settled on in whatever configuration he put them in. Must be like some secret alchemy or something. Throw in some Mullards or maybe some Goldline KT88s into the mix, and man, that'll sound great. If I hadn't purchased the standard already and had been sent the special edition for a normal review, I'd ask Thomas to sell it to me, seriously. Maybe I still will. Nah, my wife would kill me. Now, I hope this, helps you if you're considering, which one to go with. If you have any questions on this, let me know. And I hope Thomas is watching. I'd love to hear all of your thoughts. Leave comments here or contact me at the website, joyofvinyl.com. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, please, please, please take care of yourself and enjoy your records.